Welcome everyone to our webinar this month. Just let people have a few moments to filter in. There's a good bunch of you who've been waiting to get in, and I see a lot of familiar names on the list and a few new names. So welcome if this is your first time to one of our webinars. We try to do these once a month. Our format is a half hour, just quick, tech tip, some technical topics, some other topics as well. We record these and post them on our website after the fact. So if you've got to jump off early and you don't get to hear the whole thing, you can catch it on our website, usually within a few days. You can also see all of our old webinars up there too. So there's some good ones to revisit. So just let people, still some few people coming in. If you have any questions, feel free to write us in the chat and we will answer your questions as they come up. There will also be time for questions at the end. If you want to hold your question to the end, that's also okay. If we get a lot of questions and we don't get to your question, we'll keep note of it and get back to you in an email. That hasn't happened yet, so we try to keep plenty of time for questions at the end for anyone who has any to ask. So this month's topic are seasonal with turning into fall and winter. It's a good time to talk about some of these topics, some techniques, some tips for outdoor mold sampling in cold, wind, snow, and rain. This is a good topic because there's a lot of information out there. Some people have good information, some people bad. So try to get you the best information possible for this topic. So I'm going to jump right into the content now. We're a few minutes past the start time. The viewer count is kind of leveled off, so we'll get going. So first, we're just going to do a really brief intro on Sporesight. Been to our webinars before, you've seen it half a dozen times at this point, but if you're new, just a little background on us, and then we'll jump into the content, and then we will have time for questions at the end. So this is me. My name is Dylan McIntosh. I'm the lab director and product group manager here at Sporesight. I've been at Sporesight for 2 years, certified industrial hygienist and PAACB certified spore analyst. So I've done mold assessments, hundreds of mold assessments of residential homes, commercial office, industrial settings, everything from studio apartments to 100,000-foot warehouses and beyond. So I've done a lot of mold testing in my career, and I've also done analysis for mold, laboratory analysis for these exact types of tests that we offer here at Sporesight. So I'm happy to share my knowledge and get people information on how to do these things the right way. Sometimes, as you'll see, there's not necessarily the right way, but there's some judgment involved. So we'll talk about that too. TechSight is the name of our company. Sporesight is our environmental vertical, founded in 2013, and we are a tech company, a software company, and we operate in machine learning and artificial intelligence spaces. Our focus is on computer vision via digital microscopy. That means is we take digital images of microscope slides and have computer software that review and analyze those slides for target organisms in the vet, human, and environmental spaces. We do air, liquid, smearable diagnostic testing, like I said, used by labs, pathologists, vets, doctors, and home inspectors. We have 3 verticals. Sporesight is us, environmental side, looking at our mold and air quality product. TechSight is our human analysis arm, where we are collaborators with the Mayo Clinic, and VetScan Imagist is our vet platform that is a product from the company Zoetis, the world's largest animal health company. They white label our product for veterinary clinics. Here's just a few things about our lab. I'm a PAACB certified spore analyst, which means I have a certification in analysis of laboratory samples for mold. we're working towards, so at this point, we should say 2024, working towards AIHA accreditation. We have a license for the state of Texas for a mold analysis laboratory. The state of Texas is the only state in the US that requires a license for that. We also are participants in the AIHA MPAT proficiency testing program. We have a commitment to inspectors. We want to make your lives better. We want to give you a quick and accurate and affordable way to do mold testing for you and your clients. We want to give you the absolute best report out of anyone in the industry. We're striving to get you those results as fast as possible in the best form factor as our report as possible. So jump right ahead into the actual content that you're all here for. So here's some just information, some reminders on general outdoor sampling. Let's establish a baseline before we start thinking about some of the more exotic sampling scenarios. So an outdoor control or reference sample is very important to the interpretation of laboratory reports. It's standard industry practice that anytime you collect an indoor air sample, you're also collecting at least one outdoor air sample. Many people recommend taking more than one, but at least one. And there's a lot of reasons why you need to do that. The main reason being, if you're just taking indoor samples and not an outdoor sample, interpretation is very difficult, if not impossible. We need that baseline to establish. It's not a perfect science. These mold levels are constantly shifting, indoors and outdoors, but it's the best we can do because there's no guidelines or regulations or expected levels of mold in the air. So we need to have that comparison to make some interpretations. Here's some common questions from inspectors. I've heard that you should not test outdoors if the conditions are not calm and clear. Is that true? Do you need to take an outdoor sample in the wintertime? Is it too hot or too cold to test outdoors? Those are things that we're going to cover later on in their various categories. But generally speaking, you should always take an outdoor air sample. Even if the conditions outside may not be perfect, having that outdoor air sample will be better than not having it. And especially with us, if you've seen the Sports Site report, you've seen the graphics that we provide and the images that the highlights and the graphic images that we provide. If you don't submit an outdoor air sample with your project, those we cannot generate those, and your report is much limited compared to our expected report. So here's a topic that's very relevant. I'm here in Chicago. It's actually very nice today. It was 65 today, but that's going away, and then tomorrow it's going to be back in the 50s, and we'll be in the 30s anytime in the next week or so. So sampling outdoors when it's cold. So outdoor sampling. The cassettes that we use for this test, we as in inspectors, there is a gel media on most of those cassettes, and there will be manufacturer recommendations for the proper operating temperature for cassettes. So the best guidance is to follow the specific cassette you use. The aerosol, the Zephon Environmental Express aerosol cassette, most common cassette used in the industry. They do have a manufactured recommendation to not use it below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the freezing point. What's also important is storage. You want to make sure you're not storing cassettes outside of their recommended storage temperatures. So you don't want to leave a box of cassettes in your truck over a cold weekend. There could be some detrimental effects. So you want to store it in the appropriate range and operate it in the appropriate range. Indoor sampling when there's cold weather. If you're driving to a job site, you say they've been in your truck for a couple hours, that's not going to harm the cassettes at all. But you want to make sure your testing equipment and your cassettes are brought to room temperature. You let them acclimate before you do any calibration or sampling. Those components in your pump, and then also the gel and the media in the cassettes, when they're cooler, they act differently than when they're in the expected temperature range. So you want to bring them inside and allow them to acclimate. Most of the time, that shouldn't take much more than 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. but you want to make sure you let those things come up to room temperature before you start doing your activities. So we're going to get into snow and all that later. So just cold weather, follow those steps and you'll be in good shape. Outdoor sampling when it's windy. So windy conditions outdoors is what makes the natural fungal environment so variable. The wind's blowing from a certain direction at a certain speed is bringing organisms from a different place than another way. It's really providing this really hostile environment where these microscopic particles are flying all over the place from all over the place. So um, when it's really windy, your conditions outside can be totally different than if it was totally calm. In Florida, you actually can get fungal spores that are native to Africa that have come across the ocean via the winds and come to the eastern part of Florida. It's not an uncommon thing to happen because these wind currents are so strong. Um, Now, the natural environment outside directly relates to the natural environment inside of a home that doesn't have issues. So, it's still important to test, even if it's very windy. The one thing that's recommended when you're sampling outdoors in windy conditions is they recommend to sample with the inlet of the cassette facing into the wind. So the thought there is you want to make sure that wind is working for you and not against you. If you're trying to sample uh, uh, out of away from the wind or um, perpendicular to the wind, the cassette can have a hard time actually capturing any of those particulates because they're blowing with such force in a different direction. So if you base the inlet of the cassette into the wind, that would be your best bet on a very windy day. So sampling when it's raining, this is a hot topic. I'll say a lot of my stance on this comes from um, Dr. Harriet Burge, who is really a pioneer in mold assessment in our industry of mold testing. She wrote she used to have this column where you could be called Ask Dr. Burge, and she has a really good um, column from 2009 where she discusses sampling in rain and snowy conditions. And that's, this is the Einstein of air quality, essentially saying one thing. So I take what she has to say to um, to heart, and that's really what poses a lot of what we're going to talk about here is from that column and from her stance on things. When she's written the textbook on it, she's got the authority to speak on it, where some other people have recommendations that aren't quite as solid. So rainfall in the environment is dynamic. It's a stimulus to the environment that does various things. So when the rain begins to fall, there are some fungi that will release spores at the very first instance of rain. There's some spores that release from the actual, they get dispersed by the splashing of rainfalls. So you need a little bit more rain to start splashing because it's not absorbing into the surface. There's some fungi that will release spores right after the rain has finished. And there's some fungi that will release spores both dry and wet conditions. A lot of people have a thought that the rain is cleaning the air because it's falling and those raindrops are catching particulate and bringing them down to the ground, which is that is true. That does happen, but there is an active release as well. Some people say you don't want to sample during the rain because it's going to be artificially it's going to be totally different than the indoor conditions. And, admittedly, that is potentially true. But if we go back to the very beginning where I said, if you don't take that sample at all, you're missing out on a lot of context and a lot of invaluable interpretation information. So it's always really good and important that when weather conditions are different than calm and clear, that you note that in your notes. So when you go to look at the results, you can remember that when I sampled at the Smith residence last Thursday, it was raining, and that's why our results might seem a little different than it did in the same neighborhood on Saturday. it's important to keep those notes of the weather conditions if they are abnormal like that. So it doesn't clean all the mold from the air and actually introduces different types of mold into the air. So it's still important to sample even if it's raining. Now you want to protect the inlet of the cassette from the rain, because if water droplets get into that cassette, um, it won't wash the spores away, but it can cause some issues, and you want to avoid that. So some people I've actually seen, they'll sample with their pump on a tripod, and the tripod has a feature that you can rotate it 90 degrees, so that pump, that inlet is now facing sideways instead of straight up, so it won't collect as rain. I've stood out in someone's yard with an umbrella, standing over top a few, 4 feet over the inlet to make sure it's not raining. You just want to make sure you're protecting that inlet from any sort of rain. And also with rain, you want to be careful if it's thunderstorming, if there's lightning nearby, it, don't get struck by lightning to collect this air sample. Be careful and take in those considerations before you set up a metal tripod in the middle of a golf course, because your client lives on a golf course and you need to sample outside. Just be smart and avoid some big issues like that. It won't affect the sample, but it will affect you. So sampling when it's snowing. Now this is the one time where you might not need to collect an air sample, and I'll explain. So when there's snow cover, an inch, 2 inches, 6 inches, 2 feet of snow on the ground, that is covering most of the natural habitat for mold, the soil, the dirt, the plants. Obviously, the big trees might still have some mold on them, but the bulk of this mold is coming from the natural earth around you. Even in the desert, even in the forest, that's where it's mainly coming from. So in situations where you have snow cover, we're blocking a lot of that natural reservoir of fungi from getting into the air. So when you have snow cover, you may have near zero levels of mold outdoors, but you can still get those instances where wind and weather patterns can bring outdoor levels far distances. It's also true that naturally, because the outdoor levels are suppressed through snow cover, your indoor levels should also be lower in the winter. So you have a relative difference from a similar relative difference between outdoor and indoor in the winter than you do in the summer. So it's still important to collect that air sample if there is snow cover. Now, when there's active snowfall, in addition to snow cover, that could be one condition where you could be justified in saying that you don't need to take an air sample, because in those situations, it's very likely your air sample outdoors is going to be zero. And you could make the assumption it's, it's 3 inches of snow on the ground. There's another inch coming in the next 2 hours. Currently, right now, I'm going to assume those levels are zero and interpret my results as such. Now, with other labs, it's not as big of a deal, but for our lab, with our report style, you would not get the full report without the outdoor air sample. You still may want to collect that outdoor air sample so you can get the nice graphics and colors and everything. But that's a decision that you can make. And the argument could be made that that budget for the outdoor air sample could be better used for another indoor sample somewhere, if you're assuming that those levels are going to be zero in that case. So we're wrapping it up here. We're almost to the question portion, but here's just some other scenarios to consider. These aren't necessarily weather, but it's other outdoor environmental situations that you might want to think about, have in the back of your head, just in case these things might come up in your testing. So one thing is when the outdoor air has very high particulate matter levels. Conditions such as wildfires or high airborne pollution can affect your outdoor air sample. If you live somewhere that experiences wildfires commonly, or even if you don't, here in Chicago, our air quality this last summer was one of the worst areas in the world because of the Canadian wildfires and the winds that were blowing that smoke to us. In situations like this, when there's very high particulate matter levels outdoors, you get the air quality alert on your phone. That might be an instance where you want to collect a shorter duration sample outdoors. That particulate matter that's in the air is going to end up on that cassette. And anywhere where you're getting particulate matter on that cassette, that's somewhere where a mold spore can't land, and you could potentially overload the cassette with background debris if you take a sample that's too long. Now, 5 minutes, you're probably not going to experience that unless you're very, very poor air quality. But you still might want to consider taking a 3-minute sample, marking that on your chain of custody so we can calculate the volume correctly. Or if it was extremely, extremely poor, say 3 neighbors around this house are all burning wet leaves at the same time and there's smoke all over the neighborhood, maybe you want to take a 1-minute sample. That in a very extreme situation might be the best bet. Pretty uncommon for those to happen. I've never had to take that in consideration in any of my testing, but it is one of those things that you want to know about if that ever comes up in your testing. High temperatures. Now, this is another one that has to do with your cassette manufacturer specifications. Sampling outdoors won't be impacted. It could be 120 degrees outside. You could still collect a sample in that case, but you want to be careful with storage of your samples before and after testing. Again, consult your manufacturer recommendations. It's usually on the packaging, or consult their website for appropriate storage temperatures. You don't want to leave your samples in a hot car for extended periods. That can compromise the adhesive on those samples, and you can have some issues. So I got a couple questions that just came through, and we'll do those first, but officially in the question and answer period. Thanks for everyone who was around and listened in on this. And if you have any questions that come up after the fact and you forgot to ask them, you can reach out to us in the info at sporesight.com. Go to our website, paste a question into our contact form there as well. So I've got a question here from Dan. I'm switching over from EMSL. Does Sporesight chain of custody have a weather conditions box? We don't have one on our chain of custody. You're welcome to write it on the chain of custody. There's a space between the upper and lower sections of the chain of custody. We wouldn't do anything with that information differently for our analysis. It might be a good place for your because you're filling out that form either way. It might be a good place for you to notate that on the form. Some labs, big labs like EMSL or Eurofins, they have that box because they compile their data into a big database, and it's a future thing where if they ever want to use that data, they want to know the weather conditions. So your report would be the same at their lab or our lab, depending on what the weather was. Just they have a use for it outside of what we use the data from our reports for. But that's a great question. You can put on the chain of custody anywhere you want if you need it there for your reference. Matt, a similar question. Should notes on inclement weather be submitted to Sporesight with samples? And do these notes have any bearing on the report that Sporesight generates? So I kind of answered that question before. You're welcome to notate that. If you ever call us with a question and we see it and you put that on the chain of custody, we'd probably already know what your question is before we even pick up the phone. But our report is the same regardless of the weather conditions. Our laboratory process, any other laboratory's process, is going to be the same regardless of what weather is notated on the chain of custody. Brett has asked, is there preferred height from the ground to take samples from? This is a really great question. Outdoors, there's a good resource on our website in the field guide for selecting appropriate areas for sampling. But generally speaking, you want it to be at least 3 feet off the ground, 3 to 6 feet. Outdoors, you want it to be away from landscaping as much as you can. You don't want it directly on the ground. It doesn't matter if it's too high outdoors, it's not super critical, but you do want it I'd say probably no less than 3-4 feet off the ground when you're taking a sample outdoors. John has asked, what is the best liters per minute / amount that we should do for outdoors? Should that be the same or different from indoors? So the liters per minute, the flow rate, that's how fast the pump is moving air through the cassette. That should always, for the cassettes that Sporesight processes, should always be 15 liters per minute. Now, the duration, how long you sample, is the other variable, and that you can change depending on the circumstances. So, how long you take a sample for, most of the time we recommend 5 minutes. There's some instances where you could do a longer sample, 10 minutes. Some people like to take 10-minute outdoor samples when it's clear. That's perfectly acceptable. There are also some instances where you'd want to take a shorter sample. Like I mentioned, the freak circumstance where the neighborhood's full of wildfire smoke and you've got to take an outdoor air sample, you might want to take one that's shorter, 3 minutes or even 1 minute. There's variable times that you could take. 5 minutes is a good middle of the road approach. You're not likely to overload a cassette at 5 minutes. 10 minutes, it's possible. I've never taken samples longer than 10 minutes in my career, but you could in some circumstances. We have a question here. Are there instances where you don't recommend taking outdoors at all? The only time I recommend I never recommend not taking it. There are some instances where you could justify not taking one. My recommendation would be to take one outdoors. And in my career, I've even gone against this isn't official guidance from me, but I'm saying in my experience, in my career, I have taken outdoor air samples when it is below the recommended minimum temperature for sampling. And I've recovered mold and particulate on that cassette, just the same as higher temperatures. So my recommendation, you should take one every time. If, for example, there's 3 inches of snow on the ground and it's coming down out of the sky really heavy at the same time, you could justify saying it's zero or at the absolute lowest level that's not zero outside. And I would prefer to spend this sample for my client at a different location indoors. So that would be something you could justify. I've got a question here. Client had a roof leak many years ago, complained about musty odors, no visual indications of leaks like stains, deterioration of sheetrock, repaired sheetrock. I did air samples only, no issues found. Should I have done an attic air sample? Does Foresight sell the tubing needed to use with the Zephon pump to acquire attic or wall cavity sample? Musty odors are really difficult. They can be from mold, they can also be from other microbes. I don't recommend taking attic air samples, and the reason is the attic space is not, in most cases, assuming this is an unfinished attic space, are not built out to be a habitable space. So the dust tends to build up. Your housekeeping isn't as diligent, and in many climates, your attic spaces are ventilated, which allows for a lot of fresh air to come in through soffit vents or some other ventilation, and you get a buildup in the dust of a high level of just natural spores that have settled out into dust. When you're in an attic and it's dusty and you're walking around and you're going to take a sample, you've stirred up a lot of dust. And I've seen a lot of instances where attic samples come back extremely high, but not because of water damage or mold problems, but because of just the ambient dust that had collected, that had been stirred up. So attic samples are typically not recommended for air samples. Attics, more appropriate to do a really detailed visual assessment or surface samples. We don't sell those inner wall attachments ourselves. You could send us a sample for inner wall cavity sampling. If you've collected one, you just need to make sure that when you do that stylet test, that you're taking a very brief air sample, because those tend to overload very easily. and you notate that on the chain of custody for how long you took that sample. I've got two questions that I'll get to here before we'll wrap it up. Brian, would pollen season have effect on the sample integrity? I'm worried about overloading the outdoor sample. It's a great question. Pollen grains in the air sample they're very large and they take up a lot of space. But we've sampled in greenhouses, grow operation greenhouses, and not overloaded the sample with pollen. So I wouldn't say, in my experience, I've run into a situation where you need to be careful during pollen season. Uh, Typically, these cassettes are designed um, uh, to collect spores, the particulates that are generally the size of spores. So larger particulate like pollen grains actually are not as captured as high efficiency as spores are on these cassettes. They still show up and we still do get them, but I haven't seen an instance where it would overload a cassette, but that's a great question. And then the last question that I'll get to in this, if any more come in, like I said, we'll get to them in an email, or you can reach out to us if you have other questions that we don't get to. Any guidance on how best to interpret reports from samples taken during weather events and how to best convey to clients? There's a lot of variables, so each case is going to be different. So there could be situations where, for example, it's raining outside, you collect an outdoor air sample. The outdoor air levels in some spore classes are very, very, very high. You have basidiospore, ascospores in the tens of thousands, 50,000 spores. Um, and then that's on your inside. You might look at the total spore levels and be like, well, there's 100,000 spores outside, but 2,000 inside. How could there be a problem? That's an instance where you could say, yes, that is true. But if we look at the water damage indicator spores, that interpretation is still not going to change regardless of the outdoor conditions during sampling, because the Stachybotrys, the Chaetomium, the Eulocladium, these water damage indicating molds, there's not weather events that allow those to be released in the outdoor air at high levels that could obscure these big issues inside. So really, it's just a note, just in case for you. Interpreting them really is very similar. There may be some of those freak cases where there's extremely high differences outside to inside than there would be under normal conditions, but that's it. Those really classes that are really important are likely still going to be interpreted the same way as any other cassette. Now, during winter time, when the levels outside are very, very low, uh, there is a consideration to be made of those marginal elevated levels. If it was zero, absolutely no spores outside, and inside, say, there's a few hundred spores of Aspergillus penicillium, that could return a yellow highlight on our report if you're familiar, a slight elevation. But in that instance, you may be able to interpret it and say outside was nearly zero, inside was 300 spores. That is not all that uncommon to see indoors, but it could have triggered a slight response. So that would be a way to explain to a client to say, my experience, I think I didn't see any visual signs of mold or moisture in the house. We got this slight indication. I think it's just because it's winter time and the outdoor levels are so low that this difference has shown up here and triggered a potential issue. So that's something that may come up, and those ones are tricky. We've tried to design our interpretation levels and rules to take those things into consideration. Not everything can be 100% perfect, which is why that yellow slight indication is so difficult to interpret sometimes. That's regardless of weather conditions, but that could be one that with some experience you could offer additional thoughts into that based off of your note that it was snowing and there's snow cover outside. So we're a few minutes over. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I hope we got to your questions. I hope you learned something new. If there's any questions that come up, reach out to us. If you have any suggestions for webinar topics, also feel free to reach out. We're always into knowing what you guys want to hear about. This was a topic that was recommended from someone after one of our other webinars. So um, we have a schedule of these things we like to put out, but every so often we get some really good questions or suggestions from you guys. So we'd love to answer them in a 30-minute period like this. So all right, appreciate everyone. Have a good evening, and just reach out if you have any other questions.